The rain poured relentlessly, drumming against the cracked pavement as Daniel sat on the worn-out bench, his shoulders slumped under the weight of exhaustion. His hoodie, damp from the drizzle, clung to his skin, but he barely noticed. His hands trembled as he stared at the crumpled rejection letter in his lap, the third one this month. Another missed opportunity. Another door slammed shut in his face. He let out a slow breath, watching it disappear into the cold night air. The city moved around him, oblivious to the silent battle raging inside his mind. Cars rushed past, their headlights flickering like distant dreams he once chased. Somewhere in the distance, laughter echoed from a cafe, a cruel reminder of the happiness that felt so out of reach. Daniel had always believed in hard work. He had given everything, his time, his energy, his heart. Yet, life had a way of knocking him down, over and over again. Every effort seemed to end in failure. Every hope turned to dust. His bank account was nearly empty, his phone was filled with unanswered messages, and his heart carried the weight of 1,000 disappointments. Maybe this is it, he thought. Maybe I'm just not meant to succeed. The voice of doubt had been creeping in for months, growing louder each time life pushed him back. He wasn't just tired, he was drained, physically and emotionally. Giving up seemed easier than trying again. After all, what was the point of fighting when the world kept telling him he wasn't enough? Just as he was about to get up and walk away from everything, an old man sat down beside him. His clothes were simple, his face lined with years of experience, but his eyes held a warmth that felt strangely familiar. He glanced at Daniel and gave a knowing smile, as if he understood the storm raging within him. "You look like a man who's about to quit," the old man said, his voice calm but firm. Daniel hesitated before nodding. "I've tried everything. Nothing works. I'm just done." The old man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You remind me of someone I once knew. A boy who had every reason to give up but found a reason to keep going." Daniel frowned, curiosity sparking through the fog of his thoughts. "Who?" The old man leaned back, watching the raindrops dance on the pavement. Then, with a quiet sigh, he said, "Let me tell you a story." And in that moment, Daniel had no idea that the next few words would change everything. Daniel shifted slightly on the bench, his curiosity taking over the exhaustion that had settled deep in his bones. He wasn't sure why, but something about the old man's presence felt different, almost comforting. Maybe it was the way he spoke, like he had seen the same battles Daniel was fighting. Or maybe it was just the fact that, for the first time in a long while, someone had noticed his struggle. The old man took a slow breath before continuing. "There was a boy," he began, his voice steady, "who had nothing but a dream. He grew up in a small town, a place where people rarely believed in anything beyond what they could see. His family struggled to make ends meet, and most days, he went to bed hungry. Life had never been easy for him, but he held on to one thing: his belief that he was meant for something more." Daniel listened intently, drawn into the story despite himself. He wasn't sure if it was real or just something the old man was making up, but either way, it felt familiar. "The boy worked hard," the old man went on. "He woke up before the sun, did whatever jobs he could find, and spent his nights chasing a dream no one else believed in. People laughed at him. Some said he was foolish, others warned him not to hope too much. "Life doesn't give people like us a chance," they told him. Daniel let out a quiet breath. He knew that feeling all too well. The world had a way of making people like him feel small, as if no matter how hard they tried, they would always come up short. But he didn't listen, the old man continued. He kept going, even when the days got harder, even when the doors kept shutting in his face. But then, something happened. Something that almost broke him. The old man paused, his eyes darkening slightly as if he could still see the moment he was about to describe. Daniel felt his own heart beating a little faster, the suspense pulling him in. "What happened?" he asked quietly. The old man exhaled slowly. "He failed," he said simply. "Not once. Not twice. But over and over again, he put everything he had into something he believed in, only to watch it slip through his fingers. He lost money, lost friendships, lost faith in himself. And one night, much like this one, he sat alone, convinced that he had reached the end of the road. Daniel's fingers curled slightly over the rejection letter still in his lap. He understood that pain all too well. The world had beaten him down, the old man continued. And for the first time, he started to believe what everyone else had been telling him all along, that he wasn't enough. Daniel swallowed hard. The story wasn't just a story anymore. It was a reflection of his own life, his own doubts, his own quiet moments of surrender. But then, the old man said, his voice softening, something changed. Not the world, not the people around him, but something inside of him. Daniel frowned slightly. What do you mean? The old man turned to look at him, his gaze steady. He realized that failure wasn't the end of the road. It was just a part of the journey. He had spent so much time looking at what he lost that he never saw what he had gained. Daniel blinked, unsure what to say. The boy didn't magically wake up successful, the old man continued. There was no sudden miracle. No one came to save him. But he made a choice, a simple one. He chose to try again, even when he was tired, even when he was afraid, even when it felt pointless. Daniel looked down at the letter in his hands. And what happened to him? The old man smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that meant the story had a perfect, happy ending. It was a knowing smile, one that carried both pain and wisdom. He built something, the old man said. Not overnight, not without struggle. But little by little, he turned his failures into lessons, his losses into stepping stones. And one day, after years of fighting, after more pain than he ever imagined he could bear, he made it. Daniel felt his throat tighten. Who was he? The old man let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. That doesn't matter, he said. What matters is that you understand this. Weakness isn't the end of the road. Failure isn't the end of the story. The only way you truly lose is if you stop trying. Daniel sat there, the rain still falling around him, his mind racing. He wanted to believe the old man's words, wanted to believe that his own failures weren't the end. But doubt still lingered, the weight of everything he had lost pressing heavily on his chest. The old man stood up slowly, stretching his arms. You have a choice to make, son, he said, glancing down at Daniel. You can walk away now, let the world convince you that you're not enough. Or you can stand up and prove to yourself that you are. Daniel looked up at him, something stirring deep inside him. A flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The old man gave him one last nod before turning and walking away, disappearing into the night. Daniel sat there for a long moment, the rejection letter still in his hands, the old man's words echoing in his mind. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end after all. And for the first time in a long while, he thought about what it would mean to stand up one more time. The night stretched on, cold and quiet, as Daniel sat motionless on the bench. The old man's words refused to leave his mind, lingering like a whisper he couldn't ignore. You can walk away now, or you can stand up and prove to yourself that you are enough. But how? How was he supposed to keep going when everything around him pointed to failure? The weight of his past mistakes sat heavy on his shoulders. Every rejection, every disappointment, it all felt like proof that he was chasing something he was never meant to have. Yet, despite the doubt, something inside him had shifted. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there, a tiny spark of something he thought he had lost completely. Hope. He let out a slow breath and looked down at the letter in his hands. It wasn't just paper. It was another obstacle, another voice telling him he wasn't good enough. He thought about tearing it up, throwing it away, but that wouldn't change anything. The world wouldn't suddenly become kinder. Opportunities wouldn't just fall into his lap. He had a choice to make. His fingers tightened around the letter as he stood up, shoving it into his pocket. The rain had eased into a light drizzle, the streets slick with reflections of streetlights. He pulled his hoodie over his head and started walking, his steps slow but certain. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but he knew one thing: he wasn't ready to give up just yet. As he walked, his mind wandered back to everything that had led him to this moment. The sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the moments of doubt that nearly swallowed him whole. He had given everything he had, but it had never been enough. Or maybe he had been measuring success the wrong way. He passed a small cafe, its warm glow spilling onto the sidewalk. A young couple sat by the window, laughing over steaming cups of coffee. A businessman scrolled through his phone, absent-mindedly stirring his drink. A student hunched over a laptop, frustration clear on their face. Everyone was fighting their own battles. He stopped walking, staring at the scene before him. Maybe the old man was right. Maybe failure wasn't an ending. Maybe it was just part of the story, his story. He thought about his younger self, the boy who had once believed anything was possible. That boy was still inside him, buried under layers of disappointment and fear. But he was still there. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to start listening to him again. Taking a deep breath, Daniel pulled out his phone and scrolled through his emails. Rejection after rejection stared back at him, each one a painful reminder of the roadblocks he had faced. But this time, instead of letting them crush him, he did something different. He started writing. A new email. A new opportunity. A new chance to try again. His hands trembled slightly as he typed, but he didn't stop. Because no matter how many times he had fallen, no matter how many times the world had told him no, he wasn't done yet. And for the first time in a long while, he believed that maybe, just maybe, his story wasn't over. Daniel's fingers hovered over the keyboard, his pulse quickening. Every part of him wanted to hesitate, to overthink, to convince himself that this was pointless. But something deeper, something stronger, kept him typing. He crafted his message carefully, pouring his heart into every word. He wasn't just sending another application, another request for an opportunity. No, this was different. This was him refusing to let failure define him. This was him standing back up. When he finally hit send, a weight lifted off his chest, but the uncertainty remained. Would they even read it? Would they dismiss him like all the others? The doubt clawed at him, but he pushed it away. He had done his part. Now, he had to wait. Days passed, and with each one, the voice in his head grew louder. Maybe it didn't go through. Maybe they already found someone else. Maybe you weren't good enough. But this time, Daniel refused to drown in those thoughts. He kept moving. He picked up extra shifts, worked late into the night, and kept sending more applications. Each rejection stung, but it didn't break him. Not anymore. Then, one afternoon, his phone buzzed. A new email. His heart pounded as he opened it, his breath catching in his throat. We've reviewed your application and would like to invite you for an interview. For a moment, he just stared at the screen, unable to believe what he was seeing. After all the failures, all the closed doors, here it was, a chance. Excitement flooded him, but right behind it came fear. What if he messed this up? What if he wasn't ready? He could already imagine sitting across from a panel of interviewers, stumbling over his words, watching their expressions shift into disappointment. No, he couldn't think like that. He forced himself to focus, to prepare. He studied, practiced, did everything he could to make sure he wouldn't let this opportunity slip through his fingers. But even as he stood in front of the mirror on the morning of the interview, adjusting his collar and taking deep breaths, doubt still lurked in the back of his mind. The office building loomed ahead of him, glass windows reflecting the city skyline. His palms were sweaty as he stepped inside, every part of him screaming that he didn't belong here. But he kept walking. Minutes felt like hours as he sat in the waiting area, his foot tapping against the floor. Other candidates sat nearby, all looking confident, polished, prepared. His mind raced, questioning everything. They probably have more experience. They probably know what they're doing. What am I even doing here? Then, suddenly, he thought of the old man. You can walk away now, or you can prove to yourself that you are enough. Daniel clenched his fists and straightened his posture. He had come too far to back down now. The door opened. A woman stepped out and called his name. This was it. His moment. He stood up, his heart pounding, his entire future balancing on the edge of what would happen next. And as he walked toward that room, he knew everything was about to change. Daniel stepped into the room, his breath shallow, his heart hammering against his ribs. The office was sleek, modern, and intimidating. A long conference table stretched before him, and across it sat 3 interviewers, their expressions unreadable. The woman who had called his name gave him a polite nod, motioning for him to take a seat. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to keep his posture straight. You belong here. You worked for this. Don't let fear take this away from you. The first few questions were expected. Background, experience, why he wanted this opportunity. He answered carefully, making sure his words carried confidence, even if his hands were trembling under the table. The panel nodded, taking notes, but their faces remained neutral, giving him nothing to gauge how he was doing. Then, the lead interviewer leaned forward slightly, tapping his pen against the table. Daniel, your resume is impressive, but there's something we need to address. Daniel stiffened. Of course, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The man glanced down at the paper in front of him. We noticed a significant gap in your employment history. Can you explain that? His stomach twisted. He had expected this question. He had rehearsed an answer. But now, sitting in front of them, the reality of it made his throat dry. That gap, it wasn't just months of unemployment. It was months of struggle, of rejection, of wondering if he would ever get another chance. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I faced some challenges during that time, he admitted, but I used it to rebuild, to learn, and to improve myself. Every setback taught me something. And I believe that experience, though unconventional, has made me more resilient, more prepared for this role. The panel exchanged glances. Daniel couldn't tell if that was a good or bad sign. His pulse pounded as silence stretched between them, thick and unbearable. Then, the lead interviewer set his pen down and folded his hands. I appreciate your honesty, he said, but I have to ask, what makes you think you're ready for this? We've had applicants with years of experience in this field. Some even come from top firms. What sets you apart? Daniel's breath caught. This was it. The moment where he could either rise or crumble. He could have given a polished answer, something rehearsed and safe. But instead, he thought of everything, every failure, every night spent wondering if he would ever make it. He thought of the old man's story, of the boy who had nothing but a dream. He met the interviewer's gaze. Because I've fought for this, he said, his voice steady. I know what it's like to start with nothing. I know what it's like to lose, to fail, to be told you're not good enough. But I also know what it means to stand back up. I don't just want this opportunity. I'm ready to prove that I deserve it. Silence. Then, finally, the lead interviewer nodded, closing the folder in front of him. Thank you, Daniel. We'll be in touch. Daniel walked out of the building, his nerves raw, his mind spinning. He had given it everything. But was it enough? His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting another spam email, another reminder of overdue bills. But instead, his screen flashed with a name he hadn't seen in years. It was from someone he never thought he'd hear from again. And as he stared at the message, a chill ran down his spine. Something wasn't right. Daniel's hands tightened around his phone as he stared at the name on the screen. His breath came short and uneven. He hadn't seen that name in years. Not since everything had fallen apart. Not since the moment that had changed everything. The message was short. We need to talk. It's important. A flood of emotions crashed into him all at once. He should ignore it. He should delete it and walk away. But something in his gut told him this wasn't a coincidence. Not now. Not when he was on the edge of something new. His fingers hesitated over the screen before he finally responded. Where? Minutes later, he was in a cab, watching the city blur past him. His mind raced, memories surfacing that he had buried long ago. The failures, the betrayals, the moment he had decided to disappear from that part of his life. But now, it was pulling him back. The meeting place was a quiet park on the outskirts of town. The air was crisp, the evening sky painted in fading hues of orange and purple. Daniel spotted a figure sitting on a bench, back turned to him. He took a breath and approached. It's been a long time. The figure turned. It was Ethan, the friend he once trusted more than anyone. The same friend who had walked away when Daniel had needed him most. Ethan's face was different now. Older, more worn. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Guilt. Regret. I wasn't sure you'd come, Ethan said quietly. Daniel crossed his arms, keeping his emotions in check. You said it was important. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. I heard about your interview. About everything you've been trying to do. And I had to tell you something before it's too late. Daniel frowned. What are you talking about? Ethan hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. He handed it to Daniel, his hands unsteady. Daniel took it, confusion knotting in his stomach. He opened it and froze. Inside were printed emails. His emails. Applications he had sent. Rejections. But then, something else. A message he had never seen before. We would like to offer you the position. Please confirm your availability. Daniel's blood ran cold. His name was on the offer, but the response? A rejection. One he had never sent. His head snapped up. What is this? Ethan's expression darkened. You were supposed to get that job a year ago. He swallowed hard. I made sure you didn't. The world tilted. Daniel could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. You what? Ethan's voice cracked. I was jealous, okay? You had everything lined up, and I was afraid I'd be left behind. So I intercepted the email. I responded for you. I made sure you never got the offer. Daniel felt the betrayal like a physical blow. His hands curled into fists. A year of struggle. A year of wondering if he was good enough. All because of this. Ethan shook his head, his voice breaking. I regretted it the second I did it. But I didn't know how to fix it. And then I heard you were trying again. I had to tell you. Daniel's chest heaved. Anger, hurt, disbelief, it all swirled inside him, demanding release. He had lost so much time. All because of someone he had once called a friend. Ethan looked down. I know you'll never forgive me. And I don't expect you to. But I needed you to know the truth. Daniel's fingers trembled as he gripped the papers. He wanted to scream. He wanted to walk away. But deep down, he knew the past couldn't be changed. Only the future. He took a shaky breath, his mind racing. His interview, his fight to prove himself, it hadn't been for nothing. It had never been about just getting a job. It had been about proving that he could rise, no matter what. His phone buzzed again. Another email. He glanced down, his heart nearly stopping. We are pleased to inform you that you've been selected for the position. Please confirm your acceptance. A fresh chance. A real one. He looked back at Ethan, his voice steady. I'm done looking back. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving the past behind. This time, for good. Daniel walked away from the park, his footsteps steady but his mind racing. The weight of Ethan's confession still pressed against his chest, but with every step, it felt lighter. He had spent so long carrying the burden of his failures, never realizing that some of them hadn't even been his to bear. But now the truth was out. It couldn't be changed, but it also no longer had control over him. The city lights flickered as he made his way home, the streets buzzing with life. His phone was still clutched in his hand, the email glowing on the screen. It was real. The opportunity he had fought so hard for was finally his. No one could take this one away from him. As he reached his apartment, he let out a long breath and sat down on the edge of his bed. His thoughts drifted back to Ethan, to the betrayal, to the years lost. A part of him had wanted to lash out, to demand why, to make Ethan feel the same pain he had endured. But what would that change? The past was set. The future, however, was still in his hands. The next morning, Daniel woke up with a clear mind. He confirmed his acceptance of the job, rereading the words a dozen times just to make sure it was real. This time, no one was standing in his way. As he stepped into the office on his first day, a strange mix of nerves and excitement buzzed inside him. He had imagined this moment for so long, and now it was finally happening. He took a deep breath and walked inside. The office was sleek, filled with quiet energy as people moved from desk to desk. He was led to his workspace, greeted by a few colleagues who gave polite nods. It felt unfamiliar, overwhelming even, but he reminded himself, he belonged here. The first few weeks were challenging. The learning curve was steep, and self-doubt crept in more than once. But every time he felt that familiar fear of failure, he reminded himself of everything he had overcome. He had fought his way here. He wouldn't let a little uncertainty shake him. One evening, as he was wrapping up a long day, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a simple message from Ethan. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I hope one day, you'll find it in your heart. I truly am sorry." Daniel stared at the screen for a long time. Forgiveness. It wasn't easy. It wasn't immediate. But as he sat there, thinking back on everything, he realized something. Holding on to anger wouldn't change what happened. But letting go? That would free him. He didn't type a long response. Just a simple, honest one. "I'm moving forward. I hope you do too." And with that, he put his phone away, a small smile forming on his lips. Months passed, and with each day, he grew into his role. The fears that once held him back faded, replaced by confidence built through experience. He wasn't the same person who had doubted himself, who had let rejection define him. He had proven, to himself more than anyone, that he was capable, that he was enough. One evening, as he walked home from work, he passed by the same park where everything had changed. The bench was empty now, just another part of the city's landscape. He paused for a moment, looking at it, remembering the storm of emotions he had felt that night. Then he smiled to himself and kept walking. The past was behind him. The future was waiting. And this time, he was ready for it.